Two Jews walk into a bar. One of them, citing the Jerusalem Post, is in despair, lamenting the latest onslaught of attacks on Israel and a consequential spike in anti-Jewish violence across hundreds of Western cities. The other Jew, referencing the Iranian press, is delighted by tales of Jewish power as he reads aloud that the Zionists control Washington, Wall Street, Hollywood, global financial markets, and the media. Ha! If only we were that powerful, he proclaims. Now, in actuality, and unfortunately, this is not a joke, anti-Semitism is real, and it comes nicely packed in various shapes and sizes. There are three major strains of anti-Semitism circulating, different in kind and virulence, and requiring different responses. To use anti-Semitism against anti-Semites, first we ought to understand the three main types of anti-Semitism. The first type is a response to alienation. In Europe, anti-Semitism looks like a response to alienation, and is particularly high where unemployment is rampant. For example, roughly half of all Spaniards and Greeks express unfavorable opinions about Jews. Such was the German precursor for the Holocaust. During 1929 and 1932, unemployment in Germany rose from just under 1.3 million to over 6 million, corresponding to a rise in the unemployment rate from 4.5% to 24%. Nowadays, the plague of violence in Europe is fueled by young Islamic men with no respect and no place to go, as New York Times columnist David Brooks put it. The second type of anti-Semitism stems from paranoia and victimhood. In the United States, the problem is the number of people who cannot fathom what anti-Semitism is, or who think Jews are being paranoid or excessively playing the victim, adding that there are others who see anti-Semitism as merely another form of bigotry. As columnist Bret Stephens described it, quote, "While all prejudices stem from us versus them thinking, anti-Semitism differs in its emotional basis. Racism and ethnic bigotry emerge from feelings of superiority, contempt, and fear. Anti-Semites are also driven by feelings of envy and, paradoxically, inferiority. For example, to what other minority group is the word clever presented as slander? Who else is charged with the crimes of extraordinary wealth, control of media and finance, access to strange technologies, and secret control of the world's governments? The racist and ethnic bigot thinks the objects of his bigotry are deservedly beneath him. The anti-Semite thinks the object of his bigotry is undeservedly above him," wrote Stephens. "Most bigotry is an assertion of inferiority and speaks the language of oppression," he added. "Anti-Semitism is an assertion of impurity and speaks the language of extermination. Anti-Semitism's logical endpoint is violence. And finally, the third type of anti-Semitism is that the Jew is an idea, not a person. Across the Middle East, anti-Semitism has the feel of a deranged theological system for making sense of a world gone wrong. The Jew is not a person, but an idea," wrote David Brooks, "a unique carrier of transcendent evil, a pollution, a stain, a dark force responsible for the failures of others, the unconscious shame and primeval urges they feel in themselves, and everything that needs explaining. This is a form of derangement, a flight from reality, even in otherwise sophisticated people." Now that we understand the three main types of anti-Semitism, here are 5 ways to use anti-Semitism against anti-Semites. Number 1. Playing the how many Jews game. One of my favorite questions to ask other people is, how many Jews do you think are living in the world right now? Obviously, it is a trick question, because on one hand, the Jews are a tiny group, almost 15.7 million worldwide, or 0.2% of the global population. There are approximately 6.9 million Israeli Jews, compared with an Iranian population of more than 80 million, some 420 million Arabs, and almost 2 billion Muslims. In sheer numbers, Jews are clearly outmatched. On the other hand, Many people presume that there are hundreds of millions of Jews living across the world because we are disproportionately represented in a variety of public and popular arenas, such as Nobel laureates, arts and entertainment, business and commerce, the medical community, and so forth. The only arena in which Jews seem proportionate is that of athletics. When anti-Semites realize just how many, that is, how few, Jews there are in the world, their anti-Semitism tends to deflate. Because when push comes to shove, how much power and influence can 15.7 million people worldwide realistically have? Number 2, relational Judaism. In 2008, Dr. Yehonatan Turner and his colleagues at Sher Zedek Medical Center in Jerusalem noticed improved performance of radiologists reading test results from high-tech medical scanners. Why? The radiologists were shown photos of each patient who agreed to be photographed prior to the exam, and these images were added to the patient's computer files, appearing automatically when the file was opened. In a questionnaire, all of the radiologists said that viewing the photos made them feel more empathy for the patients. Can we take the same approach with anti-Semitism? I believe so. As much as Judaism is a relationship between God and his people, the Israelites, the Hebrews, the Jews, at least for those religiously inclined, Judaism is also a relationship between Jews among themselves and between the Jewish people and the greater world. When we make Judaism about people, we create a relational opportunity to play with the emotional heartstrings of our neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances. After all, it is easier to hate the idea of people than people themselves. Side note, the term relational Judaism was coined by Dr. Ron Wolfson, a professor at American Jewish University who wrote a book aptly titled Relational Judaism. Number 3, leveraging the perception of power. In 1991, after Ethiopian dictator Mengistu Haile Mariam lost his Soviet patron, he approached the State of Israel as a conduit to Washington, D.C., with the idea that Israeli influence in Washington would be enough to rescue him. The approach was anti-Semitic, but it still helped Mariam get a seat at the negotiation table and led to the rescue of Ethiopian Jews in Operation Solomon. According to Mark Dubowitz, CEO of the nonpartisan think tank Foundation for Defense of Democracies, quote, especially in a democracy, the perception of power is power, at least in the hands of those who know how to use it judiciously. From biblical times onward, Jews have often proved adept at this, not for nefarious reasons, but because we appreciate how necessary that perception can be to our own survival. End quote. Sometimes, not all the time to be sure, leveraging the perception of power can be a point of attraction. Better to be with us than against us, so to speak. Attraction is the key word here, since many Jews, in talking about their Judaism and Jewishness, try to attract bees with vinegar, whereas we know bees are attracted by honey. In this case, honey means conversations that invoke positivity. For example, unique Jewish stories, Jewish wisdom, interesting Jewish people, as opposed to vinegar or negativity, such as victimhood, and reasons to feel bad for us Jews. Number 4, explaining Jewish history. Jewish history is made up of stories that have often been about what happens to a powerless people who continuously face the harshest geopolitical realities, from bigotry and legal discrimination to expulsion and genocide. Yet, there are also stories of how Jews have used power, whether real or reputed, to flourish against considerable odds. For example, the founding of the State of Israel. A people without power are, too often, a people without a future, a fact that those who doubt or undermine the necessity for a Jewish state must fundamentally understand. The challenge is to find a way to speak about Jewish power that does not give in to anti-Semites and conspiracists. We must also contend with different manifestations of people's unease with power, particularly progressives, whose response to so-called Jewish power is so-called anti-Zionism, while echoing anti-Semitic allegations of Israel as a malignant, illegitimate, and even genocidal state. Jewish communal leaders should also explain that Israel and its Jewish supporters around the world do not wield what power they have, or are perceived to have, indiscriminately. As Michael Oren, a historian and former Israeli ambassador to the United States, observed, quote, "The IDF is generally regarded as one of the strongest and most sophisticated armies in the world. Yet it does not use even a fraction of its potential strength against the people who, if they held such power, would hesitate not a moment to direct it at Israel's destruction. Israelis fight, asking themselves at every stage whether in fact they are doing the right thing, the moral thing, the Jewish thing." End quote. And lastly, number 5, not fighting anti-Semitism. Turns out, fighting anti-Semitism is a losing proposition. In other words, trying to fight anti-Semitism sets us up for failure in dealing with it. A Canadian Jewish donor told me in a private conversation, quote, "You can't fight anti-Semitism. You can't cure it. You can't fix it. You need to have a very strong Jewish identity and a very strong Zionist identity. If you don't have that, all of the fighting against anti-Semitism doesn't matter." End quote. This is why the focus of conversations about anti-Semitism ought to be on sound, effective arguments, which naturally emerge from having strong Jewish and Zionist identities. Good arguments help us recognize complexity where we once saw simplicity. The ultimate purpose of debate is not to produce consensus. It's to promote critical thinking, according to Adam Grant, an international best-selling author and professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Part of this critical thinking ought to originate from us Jews ourselves, to find new and better approaches to having conversations about anti-Semitism, according to Kenneth Stern, director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. It is much easier to describe how anti-Semitism works than what works against it, wrote Stern. The first of the usual bromides is Holocaust education. Surely it's important that people know about the Holocaust. But how is teaching about the Wannsee Conference and Kristallnacht going to change people whose anti-Semitism is connected to seeing Jews with guns lording over their Muslim brethren in the West Bank? Keeping our focus on finding new and better approaches, rather than assuming the usual answers like Holocaust education and hate crime prosecutions will suffice, the better we'll be able to control anti-Semitism in the decades to come.